Open University.
Critic. Critic. It's the summing up word in a famous speech in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot.
That's the idea. Let's abuse each other.
Moron.
Vermin.
Abortion.
Morpion.
Surat.
Cureless.
Cretin.
Critic.
That is it, that word critic. I've never called myself a critic, unless you count the fact that I've named myself Momus after the god of criticism. Momus is a cavilling critic. And I think one of the things that appealed to me in that name was that it's really throwing stones in a glass house, because he is a god. He's a minor god who criticizes other gods. First of all, you can't win criticizing gods. They are gods. They have, unlimited powers. They're not going to want to or feel the need to change their ways. But also, I guess Momus represents a kind of a fifth columnist of his class. He's a traitor to his own class. He's a god who critiques other gods. He said that Aphrodite made too much noise with her feet when she walked, although her naked body wasn't bad. That's quite interesting, that he was nuanced in his critiques, and this is something we'll be talking about a bit later. I've been feeling a little bit guilty, actually, about a review that just went up on the Art Agenda website, because I am, in my spare time, an art critic for Art Agenda, for Spike, for Moose, for various art publications, and part of that is, if I'm just going to see a show on my own for pleasure, I will have a very low bar. I'll zip through it really quickly, and I'll just be drawn like a moth to certain things which are interesting me at the time, certain fetishes which I have, or interests, and everything else just gets discarded. And but if you're commissioned to review a show, obviously you can't do that. You have to bring a certain criticality, a certain kind of judgmentalism as part of your job description. And I guess a good critic is one who's able to do that in a kind of nuanced way, or even in an offensive way, or perhaps not. Perhaps a good critic is actually offensive when he needs to, or she needs to be. I don't know, the latest review I wrote was of a Dutch artist who's based in Berlin. He's called Joop van Liefland, and he has a show in Tokyo, I think it's closing today actually, called Time to Die. And I saw it on Halloween, so I'm describing, really seeing the parallels between what's going on up on the street, where people are, the whole area of Shibuya where the gallery is, was full, crowded, chock-a-block with corpses, with zombies, with cosplay nurses, with scary rabbits, gibbering corpses, executed men, all sorts of monsters. But this was, in a way, a reduction of the horrors of death to a kind of pantomime routine, a kind of cute cosplay ritual, ceremony. And I was seeing similar things in Joop's work, which is actually, Van Liefland's work, which was actually all based around 80s videotape, VHS, in a kind of hipsterish Berlin way. The Berlin thing is to go to markets, to go thrifting, to recontextualize old junk. To be an artist in Berlin is basically to go to the flea market. I mean, I'm reducing, simplifying enormously. And I kind of knew too much where Van Liefland was coming from. So the last sentence in my review says, like the zombies emerging obediently through the ticket gates of the Yamanote line, I could see where he was coming from. This wasn't scaring me, it wasn't jolting me into any new kind of cognition. And I think I often juxtapose, implicitly or explicitly, I juxtapose this idea in my reviews of cognition, which is actually reacting to something with your senses or thinking about something for the first time, with recognition, which is about, oh yeah, I recognize that, I recognize these themes, I see where he's coming from. So I think the problem is, as Pessoa once put it, that if I talk about things which you already know, then it's all redundant, tautological, overfamiliar, obvious, mansplaining, whatever. If I talk to you about things which are outside your ken, it's going to be incomprehensible. So I've got to find the sweet spot between those two things. And I think another dilemma the critic has is between loyalty and judgment and discrimination. And this goes back to the split between Sartre and Camus. Sartre believed you should be committed as a writer, in other words, be a communist in his terms, even join up with the party. Camus thought that you couldn't, you had to be the individual conscience, standing up, making judgments on each case on its merits, and standing clear of all that conformist collectivist thinking. So it is very much a distinction between collectivism and situatedness versus a kind of bourgeois idea of the individual hero who can stand proud and free and survey what's around him and judge it. If I go back, I think there are merits on both sides. I don't think that's been resolved. I think collectivism is pretty cool, and I think we are all implicit in our times much more than we realise. You can't really stand proud and free, but of course it is crucial to the idea of judgment. Let's go back to, in my personal history, when did I first start, I won't say becoming a critic, but I'll say reviewing things. And I think the word review is kind of interesting. It's different from the French word for the same activity, which is chronique, to chronicle something. It's almost a historical, you enter into the ledger of history, your impressions of a work of art when you write a chronique. And it's that chron implies time. There's a time element somehow. Yeah, history. You're talking also, in a sense, about how you passed your time last night. Oh, I went to the theatre last night. This is what I did. It was an experience, and I'm going to describe the experience. Not so much emphasis on judgment. The English word review, I don't think is a very good word. It does imply that you're reviewing. You viewed yesterday the play, or whatever it is, and then today you're reviewing. You're thinking about how you felt about it, subsequently. You're writing a review. I took the letters R and E out of my surname, Curry, and made this zine when I was 15 called Curryview. And it was basically just for the 5 members of my nuclear family, and I distributed this. It actually had the same logo as Dexter Sinister's Bulletins of the Serving Library. This very simplified graphic image of the head of a person reading a paper or a magazine, reading something. So it's about reading, writing, and thinking. And a review essentially, I don't know why it's so early really I came up. I was always very judgmental. I always enjoyed passing judgment. One of the family jokes in our house was that I'd written this pamphlet at the age of 8 called The Dive of Wealth, which was like a scourge, a fiery condemnation of greed, accumulation of capital, inequality, all the rest of it. A very communistic little pamphlet. And I used to do these pamphlets. I think there's a very strong connection between Protestantism, political activism, and the printing press. That's in our history as Europeans, that the printing press was enabling, obviously, of a new kind of criticality, that you could hammer up the diet of worms on the cathedral door, or you could publish pamphlets attacking powerful people. Or you could simply make a translation of the Bible. All these things were possible with the development of the printing press. And what we're seeing now is another explosion, a second explosion, possibly a third, I don't know, a fourth, but a new explosion of criticality in the forms of new technologies which the internet has given us. And we're now in what I call the here comes everybody period of the internet, when basically the kind of snooty, high-level critical discourse that happened on blogs in the noughties has turned into a kind of Web 2 social media criticality in which there are websites now very easily formatted for you to pass judgment on everything. This criticality is a source of endless amusement to me as well, because I spend a lot of time reading these websites in which people give awful reviews to restaurants. For instance, there was a really great one a couple of weeks ago about a restaurant called Casanova in Venice, and they charge by 100 grams. The price they put in their menu is for 100 grams of fish. So by the time your fish arrives on the table, you're actually being given 1,000 grams of fish. So it's 10 times as much as you expected to pay when the bill comes. And this is a scam which the restaurant knows it's doing. And what they see is that the Google reviews of their restaurant, they're all 1-star reviews. People saying avoid like the plague. This is a scam. But then they have these Indian paid reviewers to try to up their star rating. So the star rating is still like 3.5 stars out of 5, because they've basically paid these people every day to come in and write, often totally verbatim, the same review over and over again, and give it 5 stars, keep their 5-star rating up. Same thing with this fantastic, terrible page about BT Internet, how awful British Telecom Internet service is, where everybody is saying, basically, I gave this 1 star, but I would give it 0 stars if I could. This is abysmal levels of customer service, and the internet doesn't work, basically. There's a certain sort of schadenfreude you get reading this. Thank God I'm not in Britain. Thank God I didn't sign up with BT Internet. But it is, I don't know, it is a slippery slope, and I think what we're going to see possibly is, for instance, these things like Tinder, where you swipe left and swipe right. First of all, there's a banalization of critique, which is that you can only, on Tinder, swipe left or swipe right. There is no swipe slightly diagonally, quite like her, or she might be interesting, later on. Or, there is nothing like that. It's just this instant blink-style judgment, which we all are wired, apparently, according to Malcolm Gladwell, we're wired to judge things within a split second of seeing them. And that is one reaction you can have. So, but also there would be this possible, you could imagine the development of Tinder in which people reviewed ex-boyfriends and girlfriends. And actually that became part of the information that had to be on your Tinder profile. And I don't know, is it a good world where we all know absolutely everything about everyone else? Obviously, privacy goes out the window. The Google in Europe obviously is much more restricted because the European Union has imposed this right to anonymity, a right to erase information about yourself, a right not to be known, a right to, in a sense, throw things into the memory hole. It's one of the things that has annoyed me as an artist, as Momus, is that I've been rated by these websites like Pitchfork, for instance. I had a 9 out of 10 review in Pitchfork in the late 90s, and then a series of very mediocre reviews. And then Pitchfork, in their wisdom, decided to take the early good review off their website. It was written by a guy called Brett de Crescenzo, who I think was embarrassed that he'd been so effulgent in his praise of me. I later alienated a lot of American rock critics in the blog wars of the noughties by posting too much on the bulletin board where they all posted too. So that critics obviously are like, it's like herding cats when you get critics together. They're going to disagree, they're going to have different judgments of things, they're going to hate each other. And this is another thing we have to say about being a critic and writing reviews, is that it's very much prone to the Freud's idea of the narcissism of minor difference, that they're all going to very easily hate on their friends, or it's precisely those with whom they share the context and all the assumptions and presuppositions that they most disagree with. You don't waste much time disagreeing with. I mean, I don't waste much time arguing with people who say my little 5-year-old daughter could do this painting. That kind of argument is not interesting. And when I was talking, there was a piece I wrote about an Adbusters feature called the Camera and the Rock or something, which said that hipsters, gentrifying hipsters moving into areas with their cameras, the creative class, should be more radical and should be throwing rocks instead of wielding cameras. I disagreed with that, but I could see the problem, which is that either you're in the value universe of those hipsters, in which case your major concern is going to be, I mean, at the time I used the example Dash Snow versus Terence Coe. If you're in that hipsterish art world, that is going to be the crucial question. Do you support Dash Snow or Terence Coe? And you have these disagreements which are, in a sense, agreeing to disagree because you're on the same page with a bunch of people who've heard of both Dash Snow, the late Dash Snow now, and Terence Coe. And that's going to be a very small number of people. And you can get very heated in those discussions, but you do have to keep acknowledging that you are part of that community, even although you kind of hate it. I had a very ambivalent relationship with the critical community, but I mean, critique has been tremendously important. I think it's also important to say that it's now become part of not just, if you go to a hotel now, you have to review the hotel. Immediately you leave, you get these emails saying, hey, TripAdvisor needs your review, and you were so great, your review for the last hotel was reached 125 people, and keep up the good work, Nick. And they really pressure you to keep reviewing things, because that's part of their information economy. More information, the more text, the more star ratings, the better. Star ratings, I'm very negative about. I think they listicles, top 10 star ratings, all that stuff became, from the 90s onwards, really the erosion of proper criticality, which was, you have to say at the same time, a kind of personality-based, almost cult of the personality thing, because the thing which the star ratings were sort of counterposed against was writers like Ian Penman and Paul Morley, Dave McCulloch, Simon Reynolds, who had big ideas like, we should be against this rockism thing, but who did build up a cult of personality, and they were gatekeepers, they aspired to be gatekeepers in the mode of John Peel or someone like that. These people who really, if they were not on your side, and Peel and Morley were not on my side, they were not boosting my records at any point, although I admired their knowledge and their authority and their kind of didactic status, that they definitely improved the discourse and taught me a lot. And I guess they were a slightly older generation than me. But when it came my turn to make records, they were not interested, they weren't behind them. So that was a huge blow, and that's one reason why I'm not wealthy today, you could say. I didn't really shift quantities of records. And in the end, I had to go to the more despised end of, the mainstream pop market. Steve Wright was the DJ who played me, and the tabloids actually boosted me. I had to get stories. That was, the only recourse I had after being rejected by these gatekeepers. So in a sense I welcome, and certainly in the 90s I was welcoming an idea in which the long tail, we're all reviewing members of our family, 2 members of our family, goes back to my very first Car Review magazine, it becomes that little. But it's a kind of hothouse. It's a dangerous little concentrated area of judgment. And when you are with a family, how can you say I judge my family? I mean, that is a classic case of the contradiction between loyalty and. In a sense, a critic is like a spy in the cab. A critic, let's say I'm writing political reviews for The Observer. I'm given access to politicians. They will give me, unquoted source kind of leaks and things like that. And, I need to be in with them and be friendly with them, be drinking with them to get their inside information. But also I need to be critical. So there was somebody called Robert Tucker who said that ethical inquiry is only possible on the basis of suspended commitment. So you don't just follow the party line. I think ethics and aesthetics, it's a huge topic. I can't really... I think some people have replaced ethics with aesthetics. How I feel about things is all we can really talk about. We don't really have ethical confidence in our current times, but we do have aesthetic confidence. I think ethics at its worst is witch hunting on Twitter. People saying somebody's gone beyond the pale and they have to be punished for it. Why does this person still have a career, etc., etc. This person should go into rehab. All the usual vocabulary of that witch hunting. Which again is a bit like the Tinder swipe left, swipe right on a moral level. I was reading a thread the other day on a bulletin board, which artists do you admire as people, and then so people would say, well, that Ariel Pink seems like a good guy, and then somebody else saying, oh, no, I heard stuff about him. So it's all on this level of kind of innuendo, rumor, substantiated or unsubstantiated gossip, and essentially people are judging on the basis of there's no smoke without fire, which again is a kind of disintermediation of the judgment processes which we had in place in the form of courts. It's now the court of popular opinion which can make or break you, destroy your career. And we see a lot of people, or we imagine a lot of people trembling just now, hoping that they're not the next person to be cliped up to the masses on Twitter for for abuses that they may have done a long time in the past, or which may be somebody's paranoia even. It may well be true as well. A lot of this is, I'm as inclined to believe all the Harvey Weinstein stories as everybody else. And of course, as Jenny Holzer said, abuse of power comes as no surprise. So there are websites like Trustpilot. There's the consumer review thing. See, to me, aesthetic reviews have always been the thing, and I'm really interested in what it means. I was looking through my 1979 diary, where I'm a student critic for the paper Gaudi, and I'm fascinated by how important it is to me not just to read reviews. Part of my enjoyment of the new Talking Heads record, Fear of Music, for instance, or the new Bowie album, Lodger, was that I not only could listen to it, but that I was on the same page with the critics who said that these were masterpieces, or that these were interesting records, or whatever. That discourse being there in the background, and not just a star rating, not just a listicle thing of top 10 Bowie albums. Does it make it or not? Forget all that later banalization of the critical reflex. Look at the nuanced way that critics were arguing for or against these records, and that was crucial. So I'd spend hours in the Taylor building, sitting on the comfy chairs upstairs at Aberdeen University, reading the literary review, TLS, all these book papers, left-wing reviews of culture and media, all the rest of it. So it was an aesthetic judgment which contained moral judgments, because I was into Marcusean. The Aesthetic Dimension was his book about aesthetics. Often Marxists have a kind of blind spot for culture, or have a very strange take on culture, and I certainly never accepted the Marxist idea that superstructure is determined by base, that culture is simply an expression of the economic relations which prevail in the wider society. I think that's reductive, but I don't know how reductive. It might well have a fairly substantial clout of truth to it, that idea. So we're now in this rate everything world, and I don't know where it goes. I think one of the TV programs I like watching is Grand Designs with Kevin MacLeod, and that's a very interestingly structured program, because it not only looks at making something, in a really concrete way, literally concrete way. When you've got usually a couple. It's always a couple. There's a certain kind of formulaic quality to it. There is the couple. There is the build. The dream, the build, the problems, the resolution, and the reveal at the end. So Kevin MacLeod has structured it cunningly, and this is a hugely successful format which has been spun off into lots of other programs now. Restoration House, blah blah blah. Australian and New Zealand versions of the same thing. But MacLeod is allowing himself to be skeptical in the nature of the formula. He allows himself in the early stages of the program to say, I don't know if they can design it themselves, or if they can project manage themselves, or if they've got enough money to do this. They really think it's going to be £120,000? No way. He's allowed to be skeptical then, and at the end he's supposed to be blown away by how much they've achieved. Okay, they went a little bit over budget, but nevertheless they've done wonders, and it's an amazing thing, and congratulations, and hugs, kisses, all the rest of it. So everything is resolved, and there's this satisfactory thing of seeing the dream achieved. And I think MacLeod is a master in just showing with little twinkles of the eye, or raising of the eyebrow, or a kind of skepticism. There's a sort of pouty thing he does, And sometimes he makes that look more convincing than the congratulation part in the reveal at the end. So I think that's probably a clever way to be critical without seeming like a bastard. This is always the problem. My very first review for the student paper in Aberdeen University, Gaudi, was a review of a band called the Shapiros, who were doing kind of covers. They were just a stupid cover band playing in a pub. And I was sharpening my critical teeth, so I went along, and they were doing Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones, which I didn't even recognize. I didn't know the Rolling Stones' repertoire, so I picked up that line, like every young girl should, and I just thought, this is really awful, sexist, prescriptive rubbish. So I went and wrote this terrible review of them, and I think the last sentence was, I, the critic, condemn you and your support band to listen to each other for eternity as a punishment, for being so awful. And the next thing I heard back from the editor was that the Shapiros were looking for me. Luckily, the review hadn't been signed. There was no name on it. But they'd contacted the paper asking who'd written this thing to beat me up, And weeks later, they were still apparently looking for me to beat me up. So I really got under their skin. And I know as an artist, having received lots of terrible reviews and memorized them, like for instance, the NME review which said that ugly men get their hatred of women with their milk teeth, and Momus makes Nosferatu look like a Chippendale. That was Barbara Ellen, who's still plying her trade, still writing hateful stuff in The Observer on a regular basis. Bless her. Britain is probably one of the most vicious places in the world. I think Leonard Cohen complained once that the NME had written a review of one of his live shows in the 70s saying he could fuck off back to Canada where they enjoyed that kind of moroseness. And Britain, really, they really set the attack dogs on you. They obviously you get boosted as well in Britain. But at a certain point you will go out of fashion, or you used to. I mean, it didn't happen for Oasis, By that time the idea of critical waves had gone, or they'd gotten so slow that basically you could just keep riding the same wave for a whole career. Lucky old them, But in my young day, you really had maybe 5 years of being in fashion, if you were lucky, and then you went out of fashion. And I think this is another thing you have to talk about in terms of career. One of the things I'm always complaining about in the art world is that artists are repeating one basic idea. In fact, when I met the gallerist Jay Jopling once at a party in Paris, he just said that he laid it all out. This is the formula. You just need to succeed in the art world, Nick. You just need one good idea, and you just keep hammering away at it. And if it is a good idea, it'll make its mark. The dead shark or whatever, the formaldehyde animal, plus the spin painting, plus the medical cabinet. Okay, so Damien Hirst had 3 ideas, and he must have got bored with those, and he's gone off and tried to paint skulls or do all sorts of things, but nobody really wants that from him. So there is, from the public and from the art world system itself, from the dealers, this need for art to be a bit like graphic design, to be highly recognizable, to be about recognition rather than cognition. So I don't know what to conclude in this talk, except that reviewing has been very important to me, but that I feel guilty about it. I feel guilty for attacking Liam Gillick when I reviewed his Okayama Triennale earlier this year. I thought that was a great show, but I thought his work had become two-dimensional, overblown. It was too big physically. It was gimmicky. It was a bit like a fun fair. There was a sort of crazy golf course which he'd made there, and I thought he could do better. And I hoped I made that clear. I haven't heard. You always wonder what will happen when you cross the paths of these artists later on. Will they hate you? Will they remember that you said this? And it is a kind of schizophrenic thing. But I think judging is part of creating, and it's essential to keep that critical framework in mind. Whether you agree with people when they write reviews, you agree with their worldview or not, it's kind of tremendously important to be on the same page with the community of people who are making work of the kind you're making. Even to be original, you have to know what it is to be hackneyed and what the cliches are in your particular field. I suppose the last thought is from the Bible: "Judge not, lest ye be judged." But I always thought that was kind of I don't know, that's kind of bad advice, actually, because we're all judging all the time, and judgment is crucial, Why did I buy this sweater the other day in Amagasaki? I thought it was kind of interesting the way the sleeves joined halfway down the sides, and how there was this bell-shaped form to it. It's a judgment. It might be a cliche in its own particular world, but when I took it out of that world, put it into my world, it became a sort of original sweater. So I don't know, this aesthetic judgment is ongoing, and it's happening at the highest level, the Kantian level, the critique of judgment. But it's also happening at the most banal level of, hey, Nick, you haven't reviewed your hotel yet, and our system depends on that. So let's see where it's all going to go. It's all up in the air. We might be descending into a hell now, a hell in which everything is reviewed, everything is rated in the most reductive terms, and that this actually destroys lives and makes it impossible to have what the European Union is guaranteeing, at least to European citizens, which is the right to be forgotten, which implies also the right not to be judged.
Open University.